General Rudenko, the Soviet Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of senior Nazi war criminals, made a famous address about the German leadership having the morals of cannibals and the greed of burglars. The defendants knew that cynical mockery of the laws and customs of war constituted the gravest crimes. They knew it, but they hoped that total war, by securing victory, would also secure their impunity. Well, this sounds not unlike Putin's criminal war against Ukraine. But do Russian liberals recently released in custody also seek impunity for their countrymen, supposedly guiltless and disconnected from Putin's crimes and his thuggish regime? Should they be absolved of responsibility for the largest land war since 1946? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like if you enjoyed this content, subscribe and share it around your network to make sure people hear more of these important messages. Please also connect with our fantastic speakers today, who I'll introduce to. Sergej Sumlenny is founder of the European Resilience Initiative Center and a former regional director for Ukraine and Belarus at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. He's based in Berlin, Germany, is an expert in energy and security policy, human rights, and international business consulting. Stephen Douglas is a self-described expert in combat propaganda and is a former diplomat. He's also creator of Decoding Trolls and Disin Folklore. The latter has been described in a Byline Times review as a brilliant new analytical method to parse and counter disinformation. We're going to jump straight into this. Sergej, you've seen a lot of prisoners, political prisoners, released from Russia. These are perhaps the most high-profile ones since Navalny came to the West after his poisoning, and they've gone straight out there in press conferences and said some pretty atrocious things. What is your take on why this is happening, why they are saying these things, and actually who are these characters? Why should we even be listening to them?
Well, it is definitely one of several prisoner releases. We have experienced the first one of Mikhail Khodorkovsky over 10 years ago, came to Berlin. We have experienced Alexei Navalny, who came to Berlin being in coma, which was not quite a release of a political prisoner, but more or less a release of a person who the Russian state tried to kill. And now we have this mass release of many people who are all top high-rank political activists and leaders in Russia of anti-Putin opposition, and they were imprisoned for different, mostly forged accusations, like it happens in Russia. But the situation around their release is interestingly not that much related to the fact that they are leaders of opposition or that they're released, but the context of how it happened and what did he say immediately after, especially in their press conference, which they held the next day, or in numerous interviews which they gave. And here we come to a situation when we say, okay, that sounds at least strange what they have said. And especially in Ukraine, but not only among Germany's political experts too, there is a lot of raised eyebrows, I would say, and criticism about what they said. And here we can see that there immediately came calls to lift sanctions, which the West has imposed on Russia, with all the traditional explanation that the sanctions are not effective, that they should not affect the common or ordinary Russians who are allegedly against the war. And then all the interviews, like, for example, one which Ilya Yashin gave to Russia's opposition TV channel Dost, which is now sitting in the Netherlands. Before it was in Riga, in Latvia, and was expelled out of Riga for allegedly having supported Russian troops in Ukraine, fighting Ukraine, which the TV channel denied. But anyway, and then like Ilya Yashin said like very strange things. He explained that he learned about the war between Russia and Ukraine from his talks with the FSB guards. And from these FSB guards, he has got a lot of information about, as he said, sacrifice of the Russian soldiers. He didn't use the word casualties, потери. He used the word жертвы, sacrifice. And now he said the war is such terrible and is in stalemate. No victory can be found, can be reached by any side on the battlefield. That's why, said Ilya Yashin, it's important to sit at the table, the negotiation table, and as he expressed himself, to find a compromise for the points of views, I quote, points of views which are currently being battled on the ground. And then the Ukrainians said, gosh, what are you talking about? What points of views, what sacrifice, what FSB sources about the war? What does you mean? What do you mean, like stop the war? What do you mean that ordinary Russians suffer? Why are you talking that? And what is your reasons? Are you misinformed? And why haven't you informed yourself? Do you support Russia or Russian troops? Or what do you want to reach? And practically, now I wrap out, the most shocking thing was amid this press conference that Ukraine was mentioned only once. Only once. And mention of Ukraine was in the context that most of the Russians allegedly opposed this war, which, due all respect, cannot be seen as true. We see no signs that the Russians are opposing the war. We see at least indifference towards the war. No Ukrainian prisoners were mentioned. No Crimean Tatar prisoners were mentioned. No Belarusian political prisoners were mentioned, like Maria Kolesnikova, for example. And the release has been done exclusively for the Russian oppositional leaders who, once again, surprisingly, started to demand lifting of sanctions against Russia.
Well, Stephen, let's jump in here because you've had expert exposure to the language of these GRU type people and these sort of military intelligence types. Here we see a sort of a classic, which is the aggressive victimhood. This seems to be coming through, at least I detect it in some of the language. What's your take, Stephen, on this psychology and language of aggressive victimhood? And do you detect it in some of the clips you've been seeing?
Certainly, continuing on from what Sergej was just saying about this interview, which is just dropped as far as I can see, with Ilya, where he talks about how Minsk, so he both sides, he uses the term both sides, which in itself provokes in our mind the idea of there are two sides to this issue, whereas of course the metric we use is international law, and there is no two sides to it. Russia is occupying Ukraine and has been doing so since March 2014. And so he uses this term, which when we're listening to him talk, we fall into this both sides of the argument. And he mentions that Minsk 3, or that he then also has entered into the mind of Ukrainians. He's trying to enter into the mind of Ukrainians. So on the one hand, we have as the press conferences, Sergej, who's able to listen to it in proper Russian and the whole thing, and can say the authority only mentioned Ukraine once. In this short clip, Ilya mentions Ukraine several times in a structural way. So he immediately says, of course, Ukrainians had time to rearm during Minsk. So of course, Ukrainians say that Russia would have, if we have a ceasefire now, that Russia would rearm just as it did during Minsk. However, on the other hand, I would just like to say that Ukraine also would have the opportunity to rearm. And this has an impact on our psychology. It makes us think this person is very reasonable. And whereas in fact they are a Russian who's just signed, as far as I can see, all of the released prisoners signed an amnesty or an agreement with the Russian state, and then they were pardoned. So I don't think any of us have seen the content. And so he's playing the role, the classic role for a Russian in this context, which is to give Ukraine no agency and to purport to speak on behalf of Ukraine. And it's a very complicated, I mean, in some senses, I'm still reeling from listening to this 2-minute clip and trying to unpack it. But the most obvious thing for me is this: it's that you both sides by using the term both sides. And that draws us into this idea, and that he is speaking on behalf of Ukraine and on behalf of Russia, and that he's very reasonable. But of course, as Sergej and yourself have said, he is citing as the source of his information and the framing the FSB officers, who had been speaking to him. You can imagine them having cigarette breaks. And somehow he has forgotten or not known that every single interaction with these people, and I worked with some in my organization for over 7 years, every interaction with them is part of their game. So it isn't the case that you go into the interrogation chamber and that's it. And then you come out and you share a cigarette and talk about football. The whole thing is a game for them. And for him to have cited an FSB officers as the source of his information about Russia's disaster, which we're all aware of in Kharkiv direction, is an extraordinary slight. I'm hoping that public opinion will notice this because it's so obvious to us. And I suppose it's our responsibility, as you're doing here, Jonathan, which is to try and build resilience in the minds of people watching this kind of stuff so that they understand what's going on.
So, Sergej, let's take that up. Let's pick that up. So, I mean, the big question here is, have they been groomed to think in a certain way during their captivity? And are we seeing essentially hostages repeating narratives that have been planted in their heads by those who essentially have held them captive? Because if we listen to Pivovarov, he is perhaps the lesser known of the figures who've been released. I've watched less of his material. I've seen a lot of Karamurza and Yashin before they were imprisoned. And there does seem to be a difference in the tone and what they're talking about compared to the period prior to their imprisonment. But Pivovarov mentions two things, and these are core strategic direction of the Russian state, and that is remove Western sanctions and stop hitting our oil infrastructure. Why would the Russian state bring these two up? Well, because they're having a real impact. They are stopping the Russian war machine from being as effective in Ukraine. So, Sergej, do you detect a strong strategic purpose that may have been groomed into these people?
Well, I don't think that the concept of grooming them into this narrative is necessary. I do not exclude it, that they were groomed into a way, or that it could have been a part of the agreement, like don't come back to Russia and ask for lifting the sanctions. But I don't think that it was that necessary. If you look at all Russian oppositionists who are in Germany for a longer time and have never been arrested, like Maria Pevchik or Alburov or Volkov or Zhdanov or others, they sing the same song since they arrived to Germany. They try to persuade us that there are these mythical ordinary Russians who are all against the war and who just are afraid to go and to protest because they will be arrested, which we know is a lie. The Russians protest on all possible reasons. They protest against migrants. They hunt Jews in Dagestan and occupy an airport violently. They protest in Krasnodar against the war in the context of destruction of power grid by Ukrainian drones. And in this case, they protest against the war and nobody gets arrested, or very few people get arrested. They protest against like the poverty. They protest against the dams, water dams, which have been broken in the Tumen region, etc. So the Russians protest, and they do this against the authorities. And it is not that it is impossible to protest in Russia. Of course, it's not a free society, but it's not like if you go to the street and pull out like a protest sign, you will be sent to Gulag. No, it's not the case. It can happen, but in most cases, it does not. So this Navalny group and Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation, that was their traditional direction, to say we're calling for individual sanctions against top leaders, and we want them to be pressed because they are corrupt, they steal money, etc., which led to some Kafka, to some like strange consequences, like for example, the Navalnyists managed to find corruption and embezzlement schemes inside of Russia production of missiles, cruise missiles. And the Russians have removed these loops and removed these breaches and perfectionized the production of cruise missiles. And the results we have seen in Ukraine this year, as the Russians have need a lot of Ukrainian power plants, thanks to this anti-corruption research by Pevchik and her team, obviously. So that is one problem. Another problem is that in the whole this anti-Putin group, the main and the only direction of their criticism is Vladimir Putin himself. That's why they say it's Putin's war. We need to hit Putin. We need to hit Putin's friends. We need to hit Putin's financial schemes. Putin is our enemy, but not Russia, not the Russian social structure, which is at least naive. We know how many Russian soldiers voluntarily go to Ukraine. They see no problems in killing Ukrainians. They see no problem of raping Ukrainians. We have seen today pictures of Ukrainian soldiers having been disassembled literally, with his hands and arms and head being cut off of the body. We see that the number of if you look at the video calls which Ukrainian journalists organized for Russian prisoners of war to their families, you talk practically to these ordinary Russians who allegedly, according to Karamurza, Yashin, are against the war. They're not against the war. The mothers and wives, they're not against the war. They support the war. They wish Russian army victory, etc. You may say they are blind, they are brainwashed, but they are not against the war. And that's a problem. And here, once again, I'm wrapping up, we see that within this opposition, the taboo is to support Ukrainian army against Russian army. It's okay for them to call for sanctions against Putin and to call for harming Putin, but please do not harm Russian army and Russia. That's taboo. That's why, for example, Anna Veduta was the only person in Navalny's group who donated for Ukrainian army for the shells, and she was practically eaten alive for that. She turned to a pariah for a longer time because she donated for something what kills Russian occupants in Ukraine, and that was not possible. And we can explain it cynically, like they want to be Russian politicians. They don't want to say something what demoralizes their electorate, what makes them look bad in the eyes of their potential voters. But that is the hard fact on the ground. You can't stop this war either by carpet bombing Russian strategic infrastructure, like the Allied forces has done with Nazi Germany, or by supporting the Ukrainian army and imposing strongest sanctions against Russia. There is no other way. You cannot defeat that machine by saying, okay, we're confiscating another 2 yachts of Putin's friends, and they will be so angry and so scared and so disappointed that they will immediately stop the war. That is at least naive, and most probably it is the way which the Russian opposition leaders find out to create the image of anti-Putinists who they are, but without hurting the other feelings of themselves and their friends and their potential voters. So what in Germany is being called, wash me, but don't make my fur wet.
That's a very descriptive phrase, and I think very apt here. I got a question for you both in a minute, but I'm just going to fire one more at you, Sergej. We see a fundamental difference throughout this war in so-called Russian opposition voices, and you've highlighted the Navalny team's one there, which is relatively politically passive, not overtly siding with Ukraine, not supporting any initiatives to really help Ukraine win or the Ukrainian army. There are some different voices, but they really, there's this chasm where, this lot, and it seems the new lot that released, are almost certainly not going to cooperate with those who are much more clearly aligning themselves with Ukrainian victory. So someone like Kasparov Khodorkovsky, Michael Naki, Vladimir Milov, and there's one or two others, Ponomaryov, who was recently, and not uncoincidentally, I think they tried to assassinate him on the same day as the hostages released. These figures, whether you respect them or not, categorically say the only way to reform Russia is for it to catastrophically lose this war, and the only way to achieve that is Ukrainian victory. These people come out and they say that, and they also talk about systemic change. Now, we may not agree necessarily with their solutions and what that systemic change involves. We may not believe that they'll go ahead and do what they say, but there does seem to be this fundamental difference between the Navalny approach and some other individuals who are basically saying that Ukrainian victory is the only way to stop Putin.
It is of course the only way, because there is no political, I would say, drivers which could lead to change in Russia from within. So the moving impulse must come from outside. So they just cannot expect that something like catastrophic impact on Russia, which could lead to change in Russia from outside, is a good thing. Because for them, continuation of Russia, even of bad Russia, imperialist Russia, is better than uncertainty, which will come after Russia's collapse. I personally don't share this idea. I think that there will be nothing bad when Russia collapses, but they obviously have other opinion. So in this case, the only direction from where this impulse can come is a military defeat imposed on Russia by Ukraine, because that would make Putin's regime see very weak in the eyes of its subordinates, of its vassals. And that could be the trigger for liberation movement in the region. Because we know that empires which lose the war in most cases do not survive. They undergo some sort of reforms, or sometimes collapse, which doesn't obligatorily lead to something bad. So in this case, I would say that any collapse of Russia in any form would be, after all, better, even for the Russians, than the continuation of the current situation. As now, that the Russian state brings Russian people, brainwash them, and send them abroad, where they first turn into war criminals by killing other people, raping, looting, etc. And then in most cases they die. So if you ask me if it is better for a Russian young male from Yekaterinburg or Tyumen or Smolensk or whatever to live in an independent state, which can be more or less democratic, more or less successful, but without imperialistic ambitions and ability to run imperialist war, and to live in Russia, which has since many decades, and some say many hundreds of years, but you don't need to go that deep. You can count the last wars of the last 30 years, and the danger of being killed for the young Russian male in this continuation of Russia is much higher than a potential risk of some disturbance and political turbulence which can come after collapse of Russia. But for the Russian opposition, which is mostly Muscovite opposition, which mostly belongs to Moscow elites, it is just unthinkable, because they lose everything. If they return to Moscow, which is not the capital of the huge empire, a member of United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, of course will return to G7, G8, G20. Of course will return to all international platforms. It is one thing, it is what they want to have. But being head of a smaller Muscovite state without oil, without gas, without all resources, without huge army, with only maybe 30 million population, which is smaller than Ukraine, that is not the dream which they would love to live.
Let's turn to, I think, one of the challenges, because there's been a conscious choice to release these particular political prisoners. We're dissecting what they're saying with a degree of, I would say, cynicism towards it, and realism as well. Is there a fear that they actually may be listening to in Washington and Berlin, and some of the things they're saying may unfortunately be taken far more seriously than they should be in both of those capitals. Stephen, let's start with you, because you've already had experience of Russian narratives being injected into the Western political system in the course of the Minsk agreements and process.
I'm less concerned about the so-called dissidents who were released in this context, because of course, perhaps the main and what really excited me about the prisoner release was the Wall Street journalists' release, obviously on a human level, but also because Donald Trump negotiated over the airwaves with Putin and said, even before I take office, Evan Gershkovich will be released. And so I do see the necessity of the administration of getting him freed now. And that sends a very strong message. Well, I'm going to do my best to amplify one interpretation of the meaning of what that is, which is that Putin doesn't support Donald anymore. He doesn't think he's a winner. So his main card, Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, he was willing to give away prior to the election. And so when looked at in that context from the Washington perspective, then it's clear from seeing Vice President Harris speaking directly to Alexei Navalny's widow, and we saw the photograph released, that they do have an emotional attachment in the administration to this so-called opposition. And hopefully our work and the work of many people around them and closer to them than we are will counteract any words them will make on television. Support sanctions, who are impeccable friends of Ukraine. I'm not going to name names here, and have done great work on sanctions, but to clearly have an emotional and a lot of attachment, because they've gotten to know these people on a human level and their families and their support and their children very well. And for them, I would be interested to watch this play, because on the one hand, they know what the orthodoxy is in Ukrainian information space about the Russian opposition, mainly that the only opposition to Russism and to Russia is currently fighting on the 3,000 long kilometer battlefield front line in Ukraine. So that's the orthodoxy, and they're very well aware of it because they're extremely well tuned in to that. And then on the other hand, they have this romantic pre-2022 attachment to the Russian opposition. And in a way, riffing off what Sergej was just saying, the Russian opposition, on the one hand, on a platform formed before February 24th, 2022, when we could indulge ourselves to talk about the Russian opposition without, because there weren't I think the figure I have in mind is 2 to 3 million Ukrainians forcibly transferred into Russia. Russia itself has admitted 800,000 children. And so those are very much on my mind. And if they're on my mind and our minds at the time, and on the minds of Ukrainians, I suspect they'll be on the minds of some people around, people like Jake Sullivan and co. The fact that they did get them released, and Jake Sullivan didn't he cry or something? There was reports that he cried as they were being released. It does tell about him, perhaps, or at least the character of, he's a bit of a tanky, he's an appeaser. But on the other hand, he did say recently, we are bleeding Russia out. So there's still scope to believe in this. Really, I mean, it's horrific, and our job is not to support it. Our job is to support Ukraine's victory as quickly as possible. But he did give credence recently to the idea that they are just slowly bleeding Russia out. So yeah, so I'm not too worried that these voices, and I'm also take great consolation that the news cycles are out, I expect, as the source. But I suppose it's incumbent on all of us to, where we have access, to remind everyone that we have any influence over that. It's Ukrainian voices, or to amplify the Ukrainian voice, to try and get the Ukrainian voices on, as you do on your channel, Jonathan, and their perspective on this, because they're very cutting, and they saw the future with all of this long before I did. For instance, on Navalny and his crew. So I'm not so worried about that, but I am always perpetually worried. Ever since there are very significant voices in foreign ministries, in the FCO in London, in Washington, less so in Paris, but certainly looking for what I call the Crimea Compromise. They're looking to defeat that. I do hear the soundings President Zelensky is using, but I mean, I wrote about it on the 30th of March. Let's compare trolls, comparing President Zelensky's genius for emotionally resonant trolling of Putin, of Russia, of people's emotions, of our leaders' emotions, and comparing that to Putin's. So I hear these voices where he's talking about peace, and we hear what Boris Johnson and co said, and they will cite these so-called oppositionists and what they're saying. But I just think it's so obvious that these guys are not with the Ukrainian position, and so I'm pretty confident Ukraine will continue battling away both in the information space, on the information field, and on the battlefield, despite these voices for peace in Ukraine in December 2018, when President Zelensky, after he got elected, and the Paris, where the no to capitulation movement grew up in Ukraine, because there was a deal. We saw some of the documents to allow Russia to hold elections in Russia-occupied Ukraine. And President Zelensky, there was a national revolt against this, and now the feeling against this, and we heard this from Mayor Klitschko in Kyiv, when President Zelensky first, a couple of weeks ago, seemed to change his discourse or his vector to talk about maybe there is time to start talking, to negotiate. I think President Zelensky, having gone through that experience, and then immediately that we had that meeting in Paris, it was a ceasefire, and Ukrainian civil society, again, despite I hear the voices, I've seen polls recently, but I don't think this is something that anyone with power in Ukraine would seriously consider they're gonna power on. So that's my working assumption.
Sergej, what about Berlin? What's the view from Berlin? And is there a risk here that the Berlin position may become softened through the input of voices like the ones we've heard?
Well, there are several layers of this problematic from the Berlin perspective. First, we know that there was a dispute within the German government if this release is needed to be done or not. And as far as we hear from the governmental sources, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock opposed this exchange, saying that the release of Krasikov, of the Russian state killer who has assassinated Chechen oppositional leader just a few hundred meters from the office of the Federal Chancellor, the release of this person to Russia would bring more danger than more profit to Berlin. And according to sources, only the direct intervention of Joe Biden and his call with Chancellor Scholz forced Annalena Baerbock to change her position and to accept this will of two older white males who wanted to push this. I normally criticize Annalena Baerbock very often and easily for her lack of connection between her very brave and open words and very humble deeds. But in this case, she was clearly lying. And this is a fundamental problem of this exchange. First, it was not an exchange. It was everything but exchange. It was a ransom payment for a hostage taking. We have released criminals, convicted criminals, and some of them are murderers, Krasikov. And we gave them to Russia and got hostages. people who were arrested, once again, we can criticize Yashin, Ramuzar, and others for their extremely stupid, I would say, arrogant sayings at the conference, but they were arrested for nothing. They were arrested illegally. Of course, they deserve freedom. So we have got hostages and we have gave Putin criminals. What does it mean? It means that Putin, and that is what the Stasi in the GDR and the KGB in the Soviet Union told their agents: you kill, you steal, you create sabotage acts, and when you get to prison, you will be released. Don't be afraid. We will get you out. You just don't defect, and then everything will be fine. And that encourages them. They know that they can kill people, then can use chemical warfare, like polonium in London or Novichok in Salisbury. They can shoot people. They can do whatever they want. They spend like a couple of years in comfortable European prison, and then come back and they get rewarded. They will be deputies of the parliament. They will get some position at companies. They will be, Putin personally will meet them, hug them. They will get promotion. They will go to all political events. They will be stars. And that's a pretty good exchange, I think, to tell you. So by this exchange first, we have proved to the Russians, you can do whatever you want. You kill our people in our capitals, and then you just need to arrest someone in Russia, and they have enough people to arrest. And then we will exchange them. That's number one. Number two, nothing has been done to prevent Putin and Moscow and Russia of gaining new hostages with European or American passports. Our media are still operating there. Our businesses are still operating there. I'm not sure if we can impose ban on traveling of our citizens to Russia. And we have, of course, issued warnings, etc. But this continuously, repeatedly dying out of our people who came to Russia voluntarily. I don't say that we have a good solution here, but if you go to Russia voluntarily and you know that it can end badly, then why do you expect that we will release our, like the people who were killers, who killed people on our land, that we release them to give them to you? And the last thing you write in your amnesty letter, I want to have an interview with you, Mr. Putin. And what does it mean? Do you want to come to Russia again? What does it mean? Is it all a feeling of being invulnerable? It's just insane what is happening. And for Russia and for Moscow and for Putin, it is another sign that he may play the West as he wishes, because the West is weak and the West gives up. And what we could have done, we could have answered Putin with the same game. We would have said, okay, like we checked the tax declaration of your relatives who live here, of relatives of your bureaucrats. We checked tax declaration of your employees of state-owned companies, of embassies. We will go after them in the nightclubs where they go and check if they buy drugs. We check everything we can, and maybe we find something. I don't say we need to arrest them just indiscriminately. It would be illegal, but we can find what we can have on the Russians, and we can say, okay, we don't release Krasikov because these people, our Westerners, have not killed anyone, but we can release daughter of Mr. Peskov, who, I don't know, like did that and that, or the nephew of that person and that person. And that could be done. Or if you say, okay, we cannot just wildly go and look for dirt on some Russians, just act asymmetrically, just hit Russian property somewhere. Just make Russians understand what you do will make you suffer more. And that is what we have our intelligence services. We need to find where it hurts the Russians. The Russians act against us where it hurts us. And we need to act responsibly. We need to find where it hurts the Russians. And we need to act there and tell them, you have arrested Gershkovich, Ukraine gets 100 Tomahawk. And you know what? We take all the letters of Gershkovich's surname, and for every letter, there is a town in Russia which has a power plant. And this power plant gets attacked. G, E, R, etc. And we go letter by letter. And if you don't understand this message, then Pentagon can publish Gershkovich photo with all this name, Golf, Echo, Romeo, etc. And that is how it works, because you act against the crooks. And the crooks understand if you start playing their game, they love playing their games. They are masters of their games. And they play it more, and they play it better than you. So you may not accept it. You may not say, okay, like now we have to save them. They came to their homes, they have families. That's amazing. Brave people. It's all fine. No, it's not fine. It's just the start of the next hostage state.
Now, I know you both have to go and it's late. So, Sergej, I'm going to fire this question at both of you. This is the last question here. I know we could talk for many hours on this subject. One of the other things that's absent from the statements made so far from these oppositionists, and actually in this sense, it's not dissimilar from Navalny's team. We haven't heard how are they going to stop Putin? How are they going to depose his regime? How are they going to stop the GRU? It was all fairly abstract, romantic, ideal, but no actual tactics. And of course, what we see on the ground, or rather what we don't see on the ground, is we don't see political protests against the war. We don't see civic disobedience. We don't see mass sabotage of Russian military infrastructure, train lines, transport links, etc. And we don't see any passive or even active resistance at scale. I mean, we just don't. Many of the acts that have taken place are quite possibly Ukrainian intelligence service acts. There may be some sort of local networks, but we just don't see any of these things happening at a scale that could disrupt the war. Is this one of the big problems for you out of these press conferences and the Navalny school of opposition? They're not doing actually anything that could prevent the catastrophe from unfolding.
Absolutely, that is the problem. They don't see Ukraine first. They don't see Ukraine as an actor. They don't see Ukraine as a single hope for Russia to be free, which Ukraine practically is. I don't say that it should be a goal of Ukraine and of the Ukrainians to free Russia, but objectively, in reality, it's the only goal for the Russians to get free when Ukraine wins. And of course, they don't offer they don't create any steps on the ground. And it's all very comfortable for many politicians in the West, because to make a selfie photo with Yashin or with Karamurza, who have been released, and of course it's a success story. A person has been in Gulag and now he's back and it's fine, and we are so solidarity. So strong, so together, so successful. Putin will be defeated. Putin has got crooks and we have got heroes. That is the difference between our system. And that is all bullshit. It's all about balance of powers. And in balance of powers, Putin has won, and we have not. And effectively, it doesn't lead to real steps on the ground. Once again, Ukraine has received a terrible message that none of Ukrainian prisoners were a part of this deal. No Maxim Bukevich, who is a human rights champion, arrested and tortured in Russia and sentenced to many years of prison. None of the defenders of Azovstal, none of the children who have been brought to Russia. And we have videos when these ordinary Russian women brag how they beat Ukrainian children. They are the ordinary Russians which Yashin defends and which Karamurza defends. None of these children got released. None of Belarusian are prisoners. Even the highest, like Maria Kolesnikova or Sergej Tikhanovsky, the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. None were a part of that. That's a terrible message that Ukrainian lives do not matter, Belarusian lives do not matter, but what only matters is the life of well-known Moscow-based Russian opposition leaders. And they can hold conferences, they can get fellowships in Berlin, and they will dream about great Russia, which they will build together with Germany, with German companies. And this will be a lullaby which they will see forever until the Ukrainians defeat Russia, and then they will come back to Moscow and say, see, we were right. Now Russia is free.
Does what Sergej has said resonate with you at all? This idea that you've got sort of generations of distance, you've got a pattern, a narrative pattern of the kind of romantic hero rather than the active oppositionist. Is this sort of ringing bells for you in terms of some of the sort of research you've done into the, the patterns of psychology and narrative?
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, and we spoke about before about Doesnt folklore. My mantra there is look for the manna in the meme. So look at where the meme is, for instance, this idea of saying something about Putin outside of Russia, then returning to Russia, knowing you're going to be arrested, and then get Western leaders in America and Germany to negotiate your release. So we've seen that with Khodorkovsky. We know. I think we know pretty certainly that despite their then enmity, Vladislav Surkov tipped Khodorkovsky off that he was going to be arrested, yet Khodorkovsky returns to Russia. We see it with Navalny, and now we see it with Vladimir Karzai, and this pattern which repeats, and then we see it. And as Sergej was just saying about this taboo, so we see these videos all the time. This whole new genre of videos since the 24th of February 2022 of the wives, mothers, or actual soldiers on the front line, and they're still going on. I've seen some in the last week where they plead to Putin, to do something, to give them back pay, food, give them, something stuff. And the one taboo is they never think, gosh, we shouldn't be in Ukraine. God, we see this energy, this same energy in these different activities I would call memes. And at a certain point, and obviously I fall for them all the time, and I used to fall for this one the whole time, but at a certain point you have to rise above being the idiot. I mean, the clue is actually in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which is this character in Russian culture, and in all cultures, but he just wrote a great book about it, where the truth teller and the person who just can't shut up, the person who can't just keep quiet when everyone else is conforming, and that person is the idiot. And of course, the irony is the idiot is the seer. They are the enlightened person. They are the person you like to go for a beer with at the barbecue rather than the conformist or all of these people we see on the videos. And so we have the clue. So even people like Jake Sullivan and co, who probably have read a lot of Russian literature, they can see what's going on here, that they're trying to get these idiots freed who no one in Russia will ever respect or give any power to. They've never won an election. The key to power in Russia is blood sacrifice. Always was, always has been. We saw almost with the chef that he, by killing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, he was able to put the icing on the cake of anything. It's not a democracy. They haven't done. And so when we hear them dreaming about Russia collapsing in some unspecified way, and again, I defer to the really wonderful Ukrainian voices. They cut through this stuff like a knife through butter, because with great sarcasm, great humor, despite their pain. And so I defer to their views of it, that and obviously to Sergej's as well, that this is not, these people aren't, liberation will not be found in these people, or anyone who trusts these people on a human level. We can empathize with them. And I'm really happy they're out of there. But I'm 700,000 Ukrainian children, the 2 million, as you said, the Azovstal. I'm linked in with the Olenivka family group. I mean, the pain is just palpable. And I worked with prisoners who the Russians took after the Battle of Ilovsk in September 2014. Again, after an agreement had been brokered, and then Russia caught them in a cauldron and then slaughtered them and kidnapped them and enslaved them. And I worked with the mothers of the people missing, and it's just pain, the ongoing pain is awful. And not to even hear this name check by these people and the people promoting them, it is enormous pain. But we as outsiders can continue to, as you do on your channel, Jonathan, so well, is continue to amplify to the people we have influence over what we're learning from Ukrainians about their perspective on all of this. Hopefully that will make some difference.
Well, thank you both so much for this. I'm going to be planning more discussions around this topic because I think shining a light on the ineffectiveness of the Russian opposition and why we shouldn't be lulled into thinking there's a revolution, a democratic revolution around the corner in Russia that's going to resolve this war, because there isn't. We need to keep beating that drum. But Steve and Sergej, thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to speaking with you both again very soon.
Thank you so much.
Anytime. Great. Lovely to meet you, Sergej, as well.